The morning fog hung heavy over London as Catherine, the Princess of Wales, stood before her bedroom window at Kensington Palace. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the cup of tea that had grown cold in her grasp. The weight of the day ahead pressed down on her shoulders like an invisible burden that seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. William found her there, still in her dressing gown, staring out at the gardens where autumn leaves danced in the gentle breeze. He approached quietly, his own heart heavy with the magnitude of what they were about to face. The nation was mourning, and today they would lead that grief with dignity and strength, just as they had been taught, just as duty demanded. "Are you ready for this?" William asked softly, placing his hands on her shoulders. He could feel the tension in her muscles, the way she held herself rigid against the emotion threatening to overwhelm them both. Catherine turned to face him, and he saw the tears she had been fighting back all morning. "I don't think anyone can be ready for something like this," she whispered. "But we have to be strong for them. For everyone who's watching, everyone who's hurting." The events of the previous week had shaken the entire country. A tragedy so unexpected, so devastating, that it had brought the nation to its knees. What had started as a routine royal engagement had turned into something unimaginable. The images were still fresh in everyone's minds, the chaos, the confusion, the desperate attempts to save lives that were already lost. William remembered the moment the call had come through. They had been at home with the children, enjoying a rare, quiet evening together. George had been working on his homework at the kitchen table, Charlotte was practicing piano, and Louis was building an elaborate castle out of blocks in the living room. It was one of those precious moments of normalcy that had become increasingly rare in their public lives. The phone rang at exactly 8:43 in the evening. William would remember that time forever, because it marked the moment when everything changed. The voice on the other end was calm, but urgent, the way trained professionals speak when delivering devastating news. There had been an incident, multiple casualties. The details were still emerging, but the preliminary reports were catastrophic. Catherine had watched William's face change as he listened to the voice on the phone. She had seen him receive difficult news before, but this was different. The color drained from his cheeks, and his free hand gripped the edge of the kitchen counter until his knuckles turned white. When he finally hung up, the silence in the room was deafening. "What is it?" Catherine had asked, though part of her already knew that whatever William was about to tell her would change everything. "There's been an attack," William said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A school in Manchester. Early reports suggest." He paused, struggling to find the words. "Multiple children are dead, Catherine. And teachers. People were just trying to protect them, and now they're gone." The next few hours had passed in a blur of phone calls, emergency meetings, and desperate attempts to understand the full scope of the tragedy. By midnight, the confirmed death toll stood at 27 people, including 19 children between the ages of 6 and 11. The youngest victim was just 5 years old, a little girl named Emma who had been visiting her older brother's classroom when the attack began. Catherine had found herself thinking about Emma constantly in the days that followed. 5 years old was the same age Louis had been just a few months ago. She tried to imagine what Emma's mother was going through, the empty bedroom, the toys that would never be played with again, the dreams and hopes that had been destroyed in an instant. The investigation had moved quickly. The perpetrator, a troubled young man with a history of mental health issues and extremist ideologies, had been apprehended at the scene. But knowing who was responsible didn't make the pain any less, didn't bring back the lives that had been lost, didn't heal the wounds that would scar families and communities for generations to come. In the days following the attack, William and Catherine had worked tirelessly behind the scenes. They had visited hospitals where the injured were being treated, met with the families of victims, and tried to provide whatever comfort they could to a community devastated by loss. But today was different. Today was the official memorial service, and the entire nation would be watching as they led the country in mourning. Catherine walked to her wardrobe and selected the black dress she had worn to too many funerals over the years. Each time she put it on, She hoped it would be the last time for a long while. But tragedy seemed to find them, or perhaps they were simply more aware of it because of their position. Either way, the weight of public grief had become a familiar burden. As she dressed, Catherine thought about the speech she would give later that day. She had written and rewritten it dozens of times, trying to find words that could somehow capture the magnitude of the loss without minimizing the pain of those who were suffering. How do you speak to parents who have lost children? How do you offer hope to a community that has been shattered? William was getting dressed in the adjoining room, and she could hear him speaking quietly on the phone with his private secretary, going over the final details of the day's events. There would be a private meeting with the families first, then the public memorial service, followed by a reception for the first responders and medical personnel who had worked tirelessly in the aftermath of the attack. The children had been told about the tragedy in age-appropriate terms. George, now old enough to understand the gravity of such events, had asked difficult questions about why someone would want to hurt children. Charlotte had been quieter than usual, seeming to sense the sadness that hung over the household like a dark cloud. Louis, still too young to fully comprehend what had happened, had asked why Mommy and Daddy seemed so sad all the time. Catherine had struggled with how much to tell them, how to protect their innocence, while also preparing them for a world where such tragedies could occur. In the end, she and William had decided to be honest, but gentle, explaining that sometimes very sad things happen, and that it was important for people to come together to help each other heal. The drive to Manchester was quiet, with both William and Catherine lost in their own thoughts. The countryside passed by in a blur of green fields and small villages, each looking peaceful and undisturbed, as if the tragedy that had shaken the nation hadn't touched these quiet corners of England. But Catherine knew that wasn't true. This kind of loss rippled outward, affecting everyone, even those who had never set foot in Manchester. As they approached the city, the signs of the tragedy became more apparent. Flowers lined the roadways, left by mourners who had traveled from all over the country to pay their respects. Handwritten signs and messages of support hung from bridges and overpasses. Manchester Strong appeared on banners and billboards throughout the city. The memorial service was being held at Manchester Cathedral, a building that had stood for centuries and had witnessed its share of both joy and sorrow. As their car pulled up to the cathedral, Catherine could see the crowds of people who had gathered outside. Many were holding flowers or photographs, and she could see tears on the faces of strangers who had been touched by this tragedy, even though they had no direct connection to the victims. Inside the cathedral, the atmosphere was heavy with grief. The families of the victims sat in the front rows, some holding each other for support, others sitting in stunned silence. Catherine recognized some of them from the private meetings they had held over the past week. There was Sarah Mitchell, whose 8-year-old daughter Rebecca had been killed while trying to hide under her desk. There was James Thompson, a teacher who had lost his wife Claire when she threw herself in front of her students to protect them from the attacker. Each story was heartbreaking in its own way, but collectively they painted a picture of heroism and love in the face of unimaginable evil. Teachers who had given their lives to protect their students, children who had tried to help their friends escape, parents who had rushed to the school only to learn that they would never hold their children again. The service began with a choir of local school children singing Amazing Grace. Their young voices filled the cathedral with a haunting beauty that brought tears to nearly every eye in the building. Catherine found herself thinking about all the children who should have been in that choir, but weren't, all the voices that had been silenced forever. When it came time for William to speak, he rose slowly and walked to the pulpit. Catherine watched him take a deep breath before beginning, knowing how difficult this was for him. As a father himself, the tragedy had affected him deeply, and she had seen him struggle with his own emotions over the past week. "We gather today not just to mourn," William began, his voice strong despite the emotion behind his words, "but to remember lives that were filled with promise, with joy, with the innocent wonder that makes childhood so precious. We gather to honor not just those we lost, but those who survived, those who showed extraordinary courage in the face of unimaginable terror. Catherine felt her throat tighten as William continued his speech, speaking about each victim by name, sharing something special about their lives, their dreams, their impact on others. When he mentioned Emma, the 5-year-old who had been visiting her brother's classroom, Catherine had to close her eyes to keep from breaking down completely. Emma loved butterflies, William said, his voice catching slightly. Her mother told me that she would spend hours in their garden, chasing butterflies and making up stories about where they came from and where they were going. She believed that butterflies were angels in disguise, sent to make the world more beautiful. Today, we know that Emma has become one of those angels herself. The silence in the cathedral was broken only by quiet sobs from the congregation. Catherine looked out at the faces before her and saw the raw pain of a community that had been forever changed. But she also saw something else, a determination to honor the memory of those who had been lost, a commitment to supporting one another through the darkest of times. When it came time for Catherine to speak, she felt the weight of every eye in the building upon her. She had given hundreds of speeches over the years, but none had felt as important as this one. These weren't just words being spoken to fulfill a royal duty. They were words of comfort being offered to broken hearts, words of hope being shared with those who had lost their faith in humanity. As a mother, Catherine began, her voice clear but filled with emotion, I cannot begin to imagine the depth of pain that the families here today are experiencing. But I want you to know that you are not alone in your grief. Your children, your loved ones, have touched the hearts of people all over the world. Their memory will live on not just in your hearts, but in the hearts of millions who never had the chance to meet them, but who mourn their loss nonetheless. She spoke about the teachers who had shown such courage, about the first responders who had risked their own lives to save others, about the community that had come together in the face of tragedy. She talked about the importance of remembering not just how these precious lives were lost, but how they were lived, with joy, with love, with the bright promise of futures that should have been. In the face of darkness, Catherine continued, we must choose to be the light. We must honor their memory by living with the same joy, the same love, the same hope that they brought to this world every single day of their lives. We must not let the actions of one troubled individual define our community or our country. We must choose love over hate, hope over despair, unity over division. As the service continued, Catherine found herself overwhelmed by the strength she saw in the families around her. Parents who had lost children, but who still found the courage to speak about love and forgiveness. Teachers who had survived, but who were already talking about returning to the classroom because they knew that was what their fallen colleagues would have wanted. Community members who had opened their hearts and homes to support those in need. The final hymn was Be Still My Soul, and as the congregation sang together, their voices rising in harmony despite their broken hearts, Catherine felt a sense of hope beginning to emerge from the darkness. This was what made humanity beautiful, the ability to come together in times of crisis, to support one another through the darkest moments, to find light even in the deepest shadows. As the service concluded and they prepared to meet with individual families, Catherine took William's hand. They had a long day ahead of them still, more tears to witness, more hearts to try to comfort. But they would face it together, just as this community would face the long road of healing together. The weight of their duty had never felt heavier, but neither had the importance of their role in helping a nation grieve and eventually heal. Today was just the beginning of that journey, and they would walk every step of it with the strength and dignity that their position demanded, and with the genuine love and compassion that their hearts required. 3 weeks had passed since the memorial service, but the pain in Manchester remained as fresh as if the tragedy had happened yesterday. Catherine stood in the children's wing of the local hospital, watching through a window as 8-year-old Marcus attempted to take his first steps with his new prosthetic leg. The blast had taken his left leg below the knee, but It hadn't diminished the determined smile on his face as he slowly made his way across the rehabilitation room. He asked about his friends every day, whispered Marcus's mother, Helen, as she stood beside Catherine. He doesn't understand why Tommy and Sarah aren't here with him. He keeps saying they promised to play football together when he got better. Catherine felt her heart break a little more with each story like this. Tommy and Sarah had been Marcus's best friends, inseparable since they started school together 3 years ago. They had been found holding hands under their teacher's desk, where they had tried to hide together when the chaos began. Marcus had survived because a falling bookshelf had created a small protective space around him, but his friends hadn't been as fortunate. "He's incredibly brave," Catherine said softly, watching as Marcus high-fived his physical therapist after successfully completing a lap around the room. "And he has an amazing support system in you." Helen wiped away tears that seemed to flow constantly these days. "I don't feel like amazing support. Half the time, I don't know what to say to him. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that his best friends are never coming back? How do you help him understand that the world isn't always a safe place?" These were questions that Catherine had been grappling with herself. In the weeks since the attack, she and William had thrown themselves into supporting the survivors and the families of victims, but each visit brought new heartbreak, new stories that would haunt her dreams for years to come. The official investigation had concluded the week before, confirming what everyone already knew, but bringing little comfort to those who were suffering. The attacker, a 24-year-old man named David Collins, had been struggling with severe mental health issues for years. His family had tried repeatedly to get him help, but the system had failed him, and ultimately that failure had cost innocent lives. Catherine had met with David's parents, Robert and Margaret Collins, in a private session that hadn't been announced to the media. They were devastated not only by what their son had done, but by their own inability to prevent it. Margaret Collins had aged 10 years in the 3 weeks since the attack, her hair now completely gray, her eyes hollow with guilt and grief. "We saw the signs," Margaret had told Catherine through broken sobs. "We tried to get him help, but there were waiting lists and he was an adult, so we couldn't force him into treatment. We never imagined he was capable of something like this." The conversation had been one of the most difficult of Catherine's life. How do you comfort parents whose child has become a monster? How do you show compassion for a family whose son has destroyed so many other families? But Catherine had recognized the genuine anguish in Margaret's eyes, the mother's love that persisted even in the face of unimaginable horror. "Your son was sick," Catherine had told her gently. "Mental illness doesn't excuse what he did, but it helps us understand it. And understanding is the first step toward preventing something like this from happening again." The Collins family had received death threats and had been forced to move away from Manchester. Their house had been vandalized repeatedly, and Margaret had lost her job when customers at the shop where she worked refused to be served by her. They were victims too, in their own way, though Catherine knew that acknowledging this fact publicly would be controversial. William had been focusing his efforts on working with government officials to improve mental health services and early intervention programs. The attack had exposed serious gaps in the system, and he was determined to use his platform to push for meaningful changes. But Catherine knew that even if they succeeded in preventing future tragedies, it wouldn't bring back the 19 children and 8 adults who had lost their lives. The hospital visit continued with stops to see other survivors. There was Jennifer Walsh, a teacher who had been shot in the shoulder while shepherding her students to safety. She was expected to make a full physical recovery, but the emotional scars ran deep. She jumped at every unexpected sound and had nightmares every time she closed her eyes. "I keep thinking about what I could have done differently," Jennifer confided to Catherine as they sat in her hospital room. "If I had moved faster, if I had thought to lock the doors sooner, if I had hidden the children in the supply closet instead of trying to evacuate them, maybe more of them would still be alive." "You saved 12 children that day," Catherine reminded her gently. 12 families still have their babies because of your quick thinking and your courage. You can't focus on what might have been. You have to focus on what was. And what was is that you were a hero. But Catherine could see that her words, though sincere, weren't enough to ease Jennifer's guilt. Survivor's guilt was affecting many of those who had lived through the attack, from the children who escaped to the adults who couldn't save everyone. The psychological wounds would take much longer to heal than the physical ones. Dr. Sarah Bennett, the hospital's chief psychiatrist, had explained to Catherine and William that trauma like this could affect people for decades. Some of the children who survived might struggle with anxiety and depression for the rest of their lives. Some might develop post-traumatic stress disorder that would require years of treatment. The ripple effects of that one day would continue to spread outward for generations. After leaving the hospital, Catherine and William traveled to Oakdale Primary School, where a temporary memorial had been set up in the playground. The school itself remained closed, surrounded by police tape and forensic equipment, but the community had transformed the playground into a beautiful tribute to those who had been lost. Hundreds of flowers have been left by mourners, along with toys, drawings, and heartfelt messages from children all over the world. Catherine was particularly moved by a section of the memorial dedicated to the teachers who had died. Mrs. Claire Thompson, who had taught second grade for 15 years and who had thrown herself in front of her students when the shooting began. Mr. David Rodriguez, the music teacher who had hidden 8 children in his office and given his life defending them when the attacker found them. The stories of heroism that had emerged from that day were remarkable, but they couldn't erase the fundamental injustice of what had happened. These were people who had dedicated their lives to nurturing and protecting children, and they had died doing exactly that. It seemed impossibly cruel that their final acts of love had cost them their lives. Standing in the playground, Catherine found herself remembering her own school days, the sense of safety and wonder that had defined those early years. The playground equipment stood empty and silent, swings moving gently in the breeze with no children to push them, a slide that would never again echo with the sounds of laughter and play. "They're going to demolish the building," said Patricia Moore, the school's principal, who had been leading Catherine and William through the memorial. "The families voted on it last week. They don't want their children to have to go back to the place where their friends died. We're going to rebuild on a different part of the property." Catherine understood the decision, though it saddened her. The building itself wasn't evil, but it had become a symbol of tragedy rather than learning and growth. Perhaps a fresh start was what the community needed, a new building where new memories could be made without the ghosts of that terrible day haunting every classroom. Patricia had been in her office when the attack began, and she had immediately called for a lockdown while running toward the sound of gunfire to try to protect her students and staff. She had found David Collins in the main hallway and had attempted to talk him down, but he had been too far gone, consumed by whatever demons had driven him to commit such an act. "I keep thinking about the children who would have started school here next year," Patricia said as they walked through the memorial. "Emma's little brother was supposed to be in my kindergarten class in September. Her parents had been so excited about having both their children at the same school. Now, they don't have any children at all." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a group of teenagers from the local high school. They had organized a fundraising campaign to support the families of victims and had raised over £50,000 through bake sales, car washes, and sponsor walks. The young people presented Catherine and William with an oversized check and explained how they had mobilized their entire school to help. "We might not have known the kids who died personally," said 16-year-old Amy Richardson, who had organized much of the fundraising effort, "but they were part of our community. When something like this happens, it affects all of us. We wanted to do something to show that love is stronger than hate." Catherine was struck by the maturity and compassion of these teenagers, who had channeled their own fear and sadness in a positive action. It was a reminder that even in the darkest times, young people could be a source of hope and inspiration for their communities. The day continued with a private dinner with several of the victims' families. The gathering had been arranged at the request of the families themselves, who wanted a chance to speak directly with William and Catherine away from the media and public attention. The conversation was raw and emotional, filled with tears and anger and desperate questions about why such terrible things happen to innocent people. Robert Shunn, whose 6-year-old daughter Lily had been killed, spoke about the unbearable emptiness of his home without her laughter filling the rooms. She used to wake up singing, he said, his voice barely audible. Every morning, we would hear her in her room, making up little songs about her stuffed animals or what she was going to do that day. The house is so quiet now. We can't bear the silence. Maria Santos, whose husband Carlos had died, trying to protect his kindergarten students, talked about explaining to their 3-year-old son why Daddy wasn't coming home anymore. He keeps asking when Daddy will be done with work, she said through tears. I don't know how to make him understand that Daddy's never coming home. Each story was a reminder of the lives that had been shattered, not just the lives that were lost, but the lives of everyone who loved them. Siblings who would grow up without their brothers and sisters, parents who would never recover from burying their children, spouses who faced decades of life alone after losing their partners. But amid all the pain, Catherine also heard stories of incredible resilience and community support. Neighbors who had opened their homes to displaced families, local businesses that had donated services for funerals, strangers who had sent care packages from all over the world. The outpouring of love and support had been overwhelming, providing some comfort in the midst of unimaginable grief. As the evening wound down, Catherine found herself in conversation with Emma's grandmother, Dorothy Mitchell. Emma's parents had been too devastated to attend the dinner, but Dorothy had come in their place, wanting to ensure that her granddaughter's memory was honored. She would have been starting kindergarten in the fall, Dorothy said, showing Catherine a photograph of Emma dressed up for her first day of preschool the year before. She was so excited about being a big kid and riding the school bus. She had already picked out her backpack and lunchbox. Everything was purple. That was her favorite color. Catherine studied the photograph, seeing a bright-eyed little girl with pigtails and a gap-toothed grin, full of life and possibility. It was impossible to reconcile that joyful image with the reality that Emma was gone, that she would never get to experience the excitement of starting school or any of the other milestones that should have been ahead of her. What was she like? Catherine asked, wanting to know more about the little girl whose story had touched her so deeply. Dorothy's face lit up despite her tears. She was sunshine in human form, she said, always laughing, always curious about everything. She collected rocks because she thought they might be dinosaur eggs, and she insisted on saying good night to every star she could see before going to bed. She wanted to be a veterinarian when she grew up because she thought animals needed doctors just like people do. As Catherine listened to Dorothy talk about Emma, she was reminded of her own children and how precious and fragile childhood innocence really was. Every parent took for granted that their children would come home from school each day, that bedtime stories and scraped knees and homework struggles were just part of the normal rhythm of family life. But this tragedy had shattered that assumption for an entire community, replacing certainty with fear and trust with vigilance. The drive back to London was quiet, both Catherine and William processing the emotions of the day. They had met with dozens of families and survivors over the past 3 weeks, and each encounter had added another layer to their understanding of the tragedy's impact. It wasn't just about the people who had died or been injured. It was about the families who would never be whole again, the community that would forever be changed, the innocence that had been lost and could never be recovered. Do you think we're making a difference? Catherine asked as they passed through the darkened countryside. Sometimes it feels like nothing we do or say can possibly be enough. William was quiet for a long moment before answering. I think showing up matters, he said finally. I think letting people know that they're not forgotten, that their loss matters to more than just their immediate families and friends. I think that helps, even if it doesn't heal the pain. Catherine hoped he was right. Tomorrow they would attend the funeral of Mrs. Thompson, the teacher who had died protecting her students. Next week there would be more hospital visits, more meetings with families, more attempts to find words of comfort for people facing incomprehensible loss. It was a responsibility they both took seriously, but it was also an emotional burden that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. As they approached London, Catherine thought about her own children, safely asleep in their beds at Kensington Palace. She made a mental note to hug them a little tighter tomorrow morning, to listen a little more carefully to their stories about school and friends, to never take for granted the ordinary moments that made up the fabric of their family life. Because if the tragedy in Manchester had taught her anything, it was that those ordinary moments were actually the most extraordinary gifts of all. 6 months had passed since the Manchester tragedy, and Catherine found herself standing in the gardens of Kensington Palace at sunrise, unable to sleep for the third night in a row. The nightmares had become more frequent lately. Vivid dreams where she was back in that hospital room with Marcus, or sitting with Emma's grandmother, or watching the empty swings in the playground move in the wind. Each time she woke, her heart racing and her cheeks wet with tears she didn't remember shedding. William found her there, wrapped in her dressing gown, staring at the early morning mist that hung over the carefully manicured gardens. He didn't say anything at first, just stood beside her in comfortable silence. They had both been struggling with the emotional weight of the past 6 months, though they rarely talked about it directly. There was always another family to visit, another memorial to attend, another interview to give about the importance of mental health awareness and community healing. The Thompson trial starts next week, Catherine said softly, referring to the legal proceedings against David Collins. Even though Collins had been clearly identified as the perpetrator and had confessed to the crimes, the legal system required a full trial. The process would force the families to relive the worst day of their lives in excruciating detail, all while the media analyzed every aspect of the case. "I know," William replied, his voice heavy with the knowledge of what was coming. "Patricia called yesterday. She's terrified of having to testify, of having to describe what she saw in those hallways. And the families, some of them have asked if we'll be there with them." Catherine nodded. Of course they would be there. It was part of their role now, part of the responsibility they had taken on when they chose to become the public face of the nation's grief. But she worried about the toll it was taking on both of them, and, more importantly, on their children. George had started having nightmares too, though he tried to hide them. Catherine had found him awake several times in recent weeks, sitting by his bedroom window with his favorite stuffed animal clutched tightly in his arms. When she asked what was wrong, he would insist he was fine, but she could see the fear in his eyes. He had become more clingy lately, reluctant to go to school, asking repeatedly if Mommy and Daddy would be there to pick him up at the end of the day. Charlotte had responded differently, becoming unusually quiet and withdrawn. Her teachers had noticed that she no longer participated in class discussions with her usual enthusiasm, and she had stopped raising her hand to answer questions. At home, she spent more time alone in her room, and when Catherine checked on her, she often found her daughter staring out the window with an expression far too serious for someone her age. Even Louis, who was still too young to fully understand what had happened, seemed to sense the change in the household atmosphere. He had become more demanding of attention, throwing tantrums when Catherine or William had to leave for engagements, as if he was afraid they might not come back. "We need to talk to the children again," Catherine said, voicing what they had both been thinking but avoiding. "They're being affected by this more than we realized." The conversation with their children the night before had been difficult. They had sat down as a family in the living room, with all 3 children gathered close on the sofa between William and Catherine. The room felt smaller somehow, more intimate, as they tried to address fears and anxieties that were too complex for young minds to fully process. "We know that all the sad news lately has been scary," Catherine had begun, choosing her words carefully. "And we know that you might be worried about your own safety or about Mommy and Daddy's safety." George had nodded solemnly. "Jamie at school said that bad people sometimes hurt children at schools," he said. "Is that true? Could something bad happen at my school?" The question had hit Catherine like a physical blow. How do you explain to an 11-year-old that, yes, bad things can happen anywhere, but that they're still rare, still unlikely. How do you maintain their sense of security without lying to them about the realities of the world? Sometimes very sad things do happen, William had said carefully, but there are many, many more good people in the world than bad people. And there are lots of people whose job it is to keep children safe: teachers, police officers, security guards. Your school has plans to keep everyone safe, just like we have plans to keep our families safe. Charlotte had been quiet during most of the conversation, but finally she had asked, why do people want to hurt other people? Why was that man so angry that he hurt those children? It was perhaps the most difficult question they could have faced, because the truth was that even the experts didn't have a complete answer. Mental illness, social isolation, exposure to extremist ideologies, easy access to weapons. All of these factors have played a role in the Manchester tragedy, but none of them fully explained why one person's pain had transformed into such devastating violence. Sometimes people get very sick in their minds, Catherine had explained. Not like when you have a cold or a fever, but sick in a part of their brain that helps them understand right from wrong. When that happens, they might do things that hurt other people, even though they wouldn't normally do those things. Lewis had listened to all of this with the serious expression he wore when adults were discussing things he didn't quite understand but sensed were important. Finally, he had asked, "Are you and Daddy going to be okay? You seem sad all the time now." The innocent observation had broken Catherine's heart. She realized that in their efforts to support the Manchester community and fulfill their public duties, they had neglected to shield their own children from the emotional impact of their work. George, Charlotte, and Lewis were absorbing their parents' grief and stress, adding another layer of anxiety to their young lives. Now, standing in the garden as the sun slowly rose over London, Catherine felt the weight of all these responsibilities pressing down on her. The families in Manchester needed their support and presence. The public looked to them for leadership and comfort during difficult times. But their own children needed parents who weren't consumed by tragedy and grief, who could still laugh and play and create happy memories together. "I think we need to step back a little," she said to William. "Not completely. We can't abandon the families we've promised to support. But we need to find a better balance. Our children need us to be their parents first." William nodded, though she could see the conflict in his expression. He felt the weight of duty as strongly as she did, the sense that they had committed themselves to seeing the Manchester families through their healing process. But he also recognized that their own family was suffering from their total immersion in other people's grief. The ringing of William's phone interrupted their conversation. It was still early, before 7 in the morning, so Catherine knew it must be something urgent. William's expression grew serious as he listened to the voice on the other end. "When?" he asked. "How many?" A pause. "We'll be there as soon as possible." Catherine felt her stomach drop. She had learned to recognize that tone, the way William's voice changed when he was receiving news about another tragedy. "What is it?" she asked, though part of her didn't want to know. "There's been an accident at a primary school in Birmingham," William said, his face pale. "A gas explosion in the kitchen area during breakfast club. Several children and staff members have been injured. It's not like Manchester. It was an accident, not an attack. But there are casualties." Even knowing it was an accident rather than a deliberate act of violence, Catherine felt her heart rate increase. Another school, more children in danger, more families about to receive devastating news. The cycle was beginning again, and she wasn't sure she had the emotional strength to face it. But as they hurried back to the house to get dressed and prepare for another emergency trip, Catherine realized something important. This was who they were now, who they had chosen to become. They were the people who showed up when tragedy struck, who offered comfort to the grieving, who helped communities find strength in their darkest hours. It wasn't easy, and it came with personal costs that were sometimes difficult to bear, but it was also deeply meaningful work. The drive to Birmingham was faster than usual, with police escorts clearing the way through early morning traffic. Catherine spent the journey making phone calls to coordinate their response, speaking with hospital administrators, local officials, and their own staff about logistics and security arrangements. The details were becoming routine now. Private meetings with families, public appearances to show support, visits to hospitals, and emergency responders. But when they arrived at Birmingham Children's Hospital, Catherine was reminded that no matter how many times they had done this before, each tragedy was unique, each family's pain was individual and devastating in its own way. The explosion had occurred at 7:30 in the morning, just as children were arriving for the before-school breakfast program. A gas leak in the kitchen had built up overnight, and the first person to turn on the stove had triggered a blast that brought down part of the building. 3 children had been killed instantly, and 2 more had died from their injuries during transport to the hospital. 12 others were in critical condition, with burns covering significant portions of their bodies. 2 teachers and a kitchen worker had also been severely injured while trying to evacuate the children when they first smelled gas. The randomness of it was almost harder to accept than the deliberate violence in Manchester. At least David Collins's attack had a perpetrator, someone to blame, a reason to be angry. But this explosion was just a terrible accident, a combination of aging infrastructure and bad timing that had destroyed so many lives in an instant. Catherine met first with the family of 8-year-old Aisha Patel, who had been one of the children killed in the explosion. Aisha's parents, Raj and Priya, sat in a hospital conference room looking completely lost, as if they couldn't understand how they had ended up in this nightmare. She loved the breakfast club, Priya said, staring at her hands as she spoke. She got to help serve the younger children, and she felt so grown up and important. She asked me every morning if she could go early to help set up. If I had just said no on time. You couldn't have known, Catherine said gently. No one could have predicted this would happen. Aisha was doing something she loved, helping other children. That speaks to what a caring, wonderful girl she was. But Catherine could see that her words weren't reaching through Priya's guilt and shock. It was too soon, too raw. The family was still in the initial stages of grief, where nothing made sense, and every word of comfort felt hollow against the magnitude of their loss. The medical updates were grim. Of the 12 children in critical condition, doctors weren't sure how many would survive the next 48 hours. Those who did survive would face months or years of reconstructive surgery and rehabilitation. Some would be permanently disabled, their lives forever changed by a few seconds of terrible luck. Dr. Amanda Foster, the hospital's chief pediatric surgeon, briefed Catherine and William on the extent of the injuries. The burns are severe, she explained. We're talking about multiple surgeries for each child, skin grafts, possible amputations. And that's just the physical recovery. The psychological trauma of an experience like this, these children are going to need extensive support for years to come. Catherine found herself thinking about Marcus from Manchester, still learning to walk with his prosthetic leg 6 months after the attack. These Birmingham children would face similar challenges, their childhoods interrupted by medical procedures and physical therapy, their families consumed by the daily struggles of recovery and healing. The afternoon was spent moving between hospital rooms, meeting with families who were keeping vigil beside the beds of their injured children. Each room contained its own universe of fear and hope. Parents who hadn't slept in 36 hours, siblings who didn't understand why their brother or sister was covered in bandages and connected to so many machines. In one room, Catherine met 9-year-old Connor Williams, who had suffered burns on his arms and legs but was conscious and talking. He was worried about his best friend Jamie, who was in the ICU with more serious injuries. Is Jamie going to be okay? Connor asked Catherine, his young voice filled with the kind of worry that children shouldn't have to experience. We were supposed to work on our science project together this week. He's really smart. He knows all about volcanoes and earthquakes and stuff. Catherine had learned not to make promises about medical outcomes, but she could see the genuine friendship and concern in Connor's eyes. Jamie has really good doctors taking care of him, she said, and it sounds like he has a really good friend who cares about him. That's important for helping people get better. The conversation was interrupted when Connor's mother returned from getting coffee. Helen Williams looked exhausted, her clothes still covered with soot from rushing to the school when she heard about the explosion. She had arrived to find the breakfast club area completely destroyed, emergency responders working frantically to pull survivors from the rubble. "I keep thinking about how close we came to losing him," Helen confided to Catherine, while Connor dozed fitfully. "If he had been standing just a few feet closer to the kitchen when it happened. I can't let myself think about it, but I can't stop thinking about it either." This was the burden that all the parents of survivors carried. The knowledge of how narrowly their children had escaped death, the guilt they felt for being grateful when other families had lost everything. Catherine had seen it in Manchester too, the complex mix of relief and survivors' guilt that affected entire communities when tragedy struck. The public response to the Birmingham explosion had been swift and overwhelming. The school had been flooded with offers of help and support. Local businesses had donated supplies and services, and fundraising efforts were already underway to support the affected families. But Catherine knew from experience that this initial outpouring of support, while genuine and valuable, was often followed by a gradual decline in attention as the media moved on to other stories and the public's focus shifted elsewhere. That evening, Catherine and William attended a community meeting at a nearby church, where parents, teachers, and local residents had gathered to discuss how to support the families and plan for the school's future. The explosion had not only affected the immediate victims, but had shaken the entire community's sense of safety and normalcy. The school's headmaster, David Thompson, looked years older than he had just 2 days before. He had been making his morning rounds when the explosion occurred, and he had personally helped evacuate dozens of children from the building before emergency responders arrived. "We're committed to rebuilding and reopening," he told the gathered crowd. "But we understand that some families may not feel comfortable sending their children back to the same location. We're working with the Education Authority to provide alternative options while we determine the best way forward." The practical questions were overwhelming. Where would the surviving children attend school while their building was being repaired or rebuilt? How would the families of deceased and injured children be supported financially while they dealt with medical bills and lost income? What kind of counseling services would be needed for the entire school community? These were the same types of questions that had confronted Manchester 6 months earlier, and Catherine realized that communities across the country were learning, tragically, how to respond to disasters that no one should have to face. There was a growing network of support between communities that had experienced similar tragedies, a sad but necessary sharing of expertise and resources. As they prepared to leave Birmingham that evening, Catherine reflected on the differences and similarities between this accident and the Manchester attack. Both had involved children, both had shattered communities, both had left families destroyed by sudden, unexpected loss. But the randomness of the Birmingham explosion felt different somehow, harder to process, more difficult to find meaning in. At least with the Manchester attack, there was someone to blame, a clear villain whose actions had caused the tragedy. The Birmingham explosion was just a terrible confluence of circumstances: an aging gas line, a small leak that went undetected, a kitchen worker who had no way of knowing that turning on the stove would trigger a deadly blast. There was no one to be angry at except perhaps the maintenance company that had last inspected the gas lines, or the contractors who had installed them decades before. The drive back to London was quiet, both Catherine and William lost in their own thoughts about what they had witnessed. Another community shattered, more families beginning the long journey of grief and recovery, more children whose lives would be forever changed by events completely beyond their control. Do you ever wonder if we're helping or just making things worse by showing up? Catherine asked as they passed through the countryside in the darkness. Sometimes I feel like we're intruding on people's private grief, turning their worst moments into public events. William considered her question carefully. "I think about that sometimes," he admitted. "But then I remember the conversations we've had with families, the letters we've received from people who said it mattered to them that we came. I think people need to know that their loss isn't invisible, that it matters to more than just their immediate circle of family and friends." Catherine hoped he was right. but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were becoming professional mourners, moving from tragedy to tragedy like some kind of royal disaster response team. It was important work, but it was taking a toll on their own family that she wasn't sure was sustainable in the long term. As they approached London, Catherine made a decision. Tomorrow she would call the children's school and arrange to take them on a weekend trip somewhere far from hospitals and memorial services and grieving families. They would go somewhere quiet and peaceful, where they could just be a normal family for a few days, where laughter wasn't overshadowed by sadness, and where bedtime stories didn't have to compete with nightmares. The Birmingham families would continue their healing journey, just as the Manchester families were continuing theirs. There would be funerals to attend, and hospital visits to make, and communities to support. But first, Catherine needed to remember how to be just a mother, not a princess or a public figure or a symbol of national mourning. She needed to hold her own children close and remind them that the world, despite its capacity for sudden tragedy, was still fundamentally a place where love and joy and ordinary happiness were possible. 1 year had passed since the Manchester attack, and Catherine stood once again in the rebuilt playground of what was now called Harmony Primary School. The original building had been demolished as planned, and in its place stood a modern, light-filled structure designed with safety and healing in mind. But today wasn't about the new building. Today was about remembering those who would never see it. The first anniversary memorial service had drawn thousands of people from across the country. Families of victims, survivors, first responders, government officials, and ordinary citizens who had been touched by the tragedy filled the surrounding streets. Catherine watched as Marcus, now walking confidently with his prosthetic leg, placed a single white rose at the base of the memorial wall, where the names of all 27 victims were engraved in gold lettering. The year had brought both profound loss and unexpected healing. Some families had found ways to channel their grief into positive action. Emma's parents had started a foundation focused on early childhood education, while Mrs. Thompson's husband James had become an advocate for teacher safety training. But others remained trapped in the early stages of grief, unable to move forward, unable to imagine a future without their loved ones. Catherine had learned to recognize the different faces of long-term grief during the monthly visits she and William had maintained throughout the year. There was Maria Santos, who had thrown herself into community work with such intensity that friends worried she was avoiding her own healing process. There was Robert Chun, who had become increasingly isolated and bitter, unable to find meaning in a world that had taken his daughter away so randomly and cruelly. The most difficult visits were with families who had simply disappeared into their pain. The Patels, who had moved away from Manchester entirely and cut contact with most of their support network. The Williams family, whose marriage had not survived the stress of watching their son Connor's lengthy recovery from his burns in the Birmingham explosion. Tragedy, Catherine had learned, didn't just take lives, it could destroy everything in its wake, leaving surviving families fractured and struggling to find their way back to each other. But there had been moments of unexpected grace too. Jennifer Walsh, the teacher who had survived the Manchester attack with severe physical and emotional wounds, had returned to teaching just 6 months later. She worked now with a specialized program for children who had experienced trauma, using her own healing journey to help others find their way forward. I realized that hiding from what happened wasn't protecting me, Jennifer had told Catherine during one of their recent meetings. The memories were there whether I was teaching or not. But when I'm working with these kids, when I see them start to smile again or feel safe enough to take risks in their learning, I remember why I became a teacher in the first place. It doesn't erase what happened, but it gives it meaning. The memorial service began with a performance by the Manchester Children's Choir, many of whose members were survivors of the attack. Their voices rose together in a song specially composed for the occasion, a piece that acknowledged both loss and hope, pain and healing. Catherine found herself crying openly as she listened, no longer concerned about maintaining the composure that had been so important in those first raw weeks after the tragedy. William spoke first, his words carefully chosen to honor both the dead and the living, to acknowledge the ongoing pain while also celebrating the resilience and courage that had emerged from the darkness. He talked about the changes that had been implemented over the past year: improved mental health services, better crisis response protocols, new safety measures in schools across the country. "We cannot bring back those we lost," Williams said, his voice carrying clearly across the crowd. "But we can honor their memory by building the kind of world they would have wanted to grow up in. A world where children are safe, where troubled individuals get the help they need before they hurt others, where communities come together to support each other through the darkest times." When it came time for Catherine to speak, she walked slowly to the podium, looking out at the sea of faces before her. She could see Emma's grandmother Dorothy in the front row, Marcus and his mother Helen sitting beside other survivor families, first responders who still bore the emotional scars of what they had witnessed that day. "A year ago, I stood in this community and promised that you would not be forgotten," Catherine began. "Today, I can say with certainty that promise has been kept. Not just by William and me, but by people all over the world who continue to hold you in their hearts, who have learned your children's names and carry their stories forward." She spoke about the letters that still arrive daily at Kensington Palace from children who wanted to send drawings to the survivors, from adults who had been inspired by the community's resilience to make positive changes in their own lives. She talked about the schools that had implemented new anti-bullying programs in honor of the Manchester victims, the mental health clinics that had been funded by donations from people who would never visit Manchester, but who felt connected to its story. "Your children's lives had meaning," Catherine continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "Not because of how they died, but because of how they lived, and because of how their memory continues to inspire others to choose love over hate, hope over despair, community over isolation." The most powerful moment of the service came when the families of victims were invited to speak about their loved ones. Some chose to share favorite memories. Others read poems or letters their children had written. Dorothy Mitchell spoke about Emma's continuing presence in her life, how she felt her granddaughter's spirit in every butterfly she saw, in every act of kindness she witnessed. "Emma believed that butterflies were angels in disguise," Dorothy said, her voice carrying despite her tears. "This year, I've seen angels everywhere. In the nurses who cared for the injured with such tenderness, in the strangers who sent toys and letters from thousands of miles away, in the children who refused to let fear stop them from learning and playing and dreaming. Emma is still here, still making the world more beautiful, just in ways we couldn't have imagined." After the public service, Catherine and William attended a private reception for the families and closest supporters. The atmosphere was different from the formal memorial, more intimate, more honest about the ongoing struggles that grief entailed. People talked about the good days and the bad days, the unexpected triggers that could send them spiraling back into fresh pain, the small victories that marked progress in their healing journey. Connor Williams was there, having traveled from Birmingham with his father. His parents' marriage had indeed ended in divorce, but both parents had worked hard to maintain stability for their son during his recovery. Connor's burns had healed better than doctors had initially expected, and he had returned to school full-time just 3 months after the explosion. "I still have nightmares sometimes," Connor confided to Catherine when she asked how he was doing. "But they're different now. In the beginning, I was always trapped in the explosion, feeling the heat and hearing the noise. Now, sometimes I dream that I save people, that I help them get out safely. My therapist says that means my brain is healing too, not just my body." It was a reminder that healing from trauma was not a linear process, that progress came in waves and setbacks, that the journey back to wholeness took different forms for each person. Some survivors had found strength in advocacy and activism, channeling their experience into efforts to prevent similar tragedies. Others had healed through art or writing, or simply by returning to the ordinary rhythms of daily life. As the reception continued, Catherine found herself in conversation with Dr. Sarah Bennett, the psychiatrist who had worked with many of the Manchester survivors throughout the year. Dr. Bennett had become something of an expert on community trauma response, consulting with other cities that had experienced mass casualty events. What have you learned that might help other communities facing similar situations? Catherine asked. That there's no timeline for grief, Dr. Bennett replied. The public wants these stories to have neat endings. Families that heal completely, communities that emerge stronger than before. But the reality is much more complex. Some people will carry these scars for the rest of their lives, and that's not a failure of healing. It's just the reality of surviving something that should never have happened. Dr. Bennett also talked about the importance of long-term support, not just in the immediate aftermath of tragedy, but in the months and years that followed. The media attention fades, the public moves on to other crises, but the families are still dealing with the daily reality of their loss. That's when sustained, quiet support becomes so important. The kind of support that doesn't make headlines, but that makes real difference in people's lives. This long-term commitment was something Catherine and William had wrestled with throughout the year. Their continued involvement with the Manchester and Birmingham communities had been meaningful and appreciated, but it had also required sacrifices from their own family. The children had adjusted better than Catherine had initially feared, but there had been costs. Missed bedtime stories because of late-night flights to memorial services, family vacations interrupted by emergency hospital visits, dinnertime conversations dominated by discussions of tragedy and grief. They had worked with family therapists to find better balance, to create boundaries that allowed them to fulfill their public duties while also protecting their children's emotional well-being. George, Charlotte, and Lewis had all been included in age-appropriate volunteer activities, helping to pack care packages for affected families or participating in fundraising walks. It was important for them to understand that their parents' work had positive impact, that grief and service could coexist with joy and normal family life. As the anniversary events concluded and they prepared to return to London, Catherine reflected on how much had changed over the past year. Not just for the affected communities, but for her own understanding of what it meant to serve others during times of crisis. She had learned that there were no perfect words for ultimate loss, no gestures that could truly ease the pain of burying a child or losing a spouse. But she had also learned that presence itself had value, that showing up consistently over time mattered even when individual visits felt inadequate. The work had changed her in ways she was still discovering. She was more aware now of the fragility of ordinary life, more grateful for unremarkable days when her family was safe and healthy and together. She paid closer attention to news reports about violence and accidents, understanding now the ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate victims. She had a deeper appreciation for the first responders, medical personnel, and counselors who dealt with trauma as their daily profession. But perhaps most importantly, she had learned about the incredible resilience of the human spirit. She had watched families find ways to honor their dead while still embracing life, had seen communities come together in ways that transcended political and social divisions, had witnessed ordinary people perform extraordinary acts of compassion and courage. The children whose names were now engraved on memorial walls would never be forgotten, but they would also never grow up, never fulfill the potential that their brief lives had promised. That was the unbearable reality that their families faced every day. But their memory had inspired changes that might prevent future tragedies, had brought people together in support of one another, had demonstrated the power of love to persist even in the face of unimaginable loss. As Catherine looked out the car window on the drive back to London, she saw ordinary families going about their evening routines. Parents walking with children, teenagers riding bicycles, couples holding hands as they strolled through parks. It was the kind of normal, peaceful scene that she had once taken for granted, but that now filled her with profound gratitude. Tomorrow there would be other duties, other families to support, other communities working through their own challenges and tragedies. The work of service was never finished, the need for compassion and leadership never completely fulfilled. But tonight, Catherine was looking forward to tucking her own children into their beds, to reading bedtime stories that ended with happily ever after, to falling asleep knowing that her family was safe and whole. The year of grief had taught her many things, but perhaps the most valuable lesson was the importance of holding both sorrow and joy simultaneously, to honor those who have been lost while still celebrating those who remained, to acknowledge the reality of suffering while still believing in the possibility of healing, to serve others in their darkest hours while still protecting the light within her own family. It was a balance she would continue to work at, a responsibility she would carry for the rest of her life. But it was also a privilege to be trusted with others' pain, to witness the best of human nature in the worst of circumstances, to be part of communities finding their way from darkness back toward hope. The crown she wore was heavy with more than just gold and jewels. It carried the weight of a nation's grief and the promise of its healing. And that, she had learned, was exactly as it should be.